just to continue with the talk, today we have uh, Dr. Jimmy Stewart from Virginia Tech to be talking about reproductive anatomy and physiology of small ruminants. So we are so happy to be doing this. And next, December 1st, we are going to have Dr. Philip Sponenberg from Virginia Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine, and he will be talking about selection in small ruminants. So I think we are going to have a very good time. So it's your time, Dr. Stewart. Just for the people to know, because last Monday we didn't have, but during presentation of Dr. Stewart, we are going to have polls or questions. So this is to see if you are keeping just watching, and we know that you are very smart. So we'll be applying the questions and several options to answer. You may be selecting one of those. And we are going to have like the quiz, the poll over there, like for 1 or 2 minutes, 1 minute. And once that everybody or most of you answer that poll, we are going to show the result. And Dr. Stewart will be just commenting about your answers. So she will be telling us when are going to have the first question, the second, and the third. We have 3 questions, and we have like a 4 choice answer for each question. Okay, so you want to share your screen now, Dr. Stewart? Okay, good.
Okay, so I was just kind of looking in here. Yeah, well, I have to. Okay. So hopefully you can see that okay. Okay. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everybody who is here with us again this week and are going to be going through these topics. So I gave kind of a very brief introduction of reproduction in general last week. So today my goal is to expand upon the reproductive anatomy and physiology. And sorry, this should say sheep and goats. I forgot to edit my title. So this is for both of our small ruminants. So I'm going to do a little comparison and contrast. So I've got a few different pictures here. So this is a goat uterus right here that we were doing some embryo transfer on. So just a quick identification is right here is where the uterine body is. So, and attached to the uterine body, what would be coming, kind of outside the body would be the cervix. On the other side of the uterine body, it breaks off into a couple of uterine horns, and you can see that the uterine horns kind of curl themselves around. So this is where implantation and pregnancy will be for most of these. And you'll notice that with our small ruminants that the uterine horns are pretty pronounced, and that's because they, do tend to have, twins, sometimes triplets. So they have a little bit more uterine horn than a species like a horse, where it would have mostly uterine body and no uterine horns. So this one is these are both from a sheep. So this is a little cut section that we had. So over here, again, this is where the uterine body is right before it bifurcates into these 2 little uterine horns. Back here, it got cut off after the cervix, so you can't see that. But then again, these little uterine horns are kind of curled around. You can see kind of the curl around here. And then between the uterine horns and the ovary, I think it got dissected here. But you can see a little bit right here is what we would think of in humans called the fallopian tube. We tend to call it uterine tube in in our small ruminant species, but the same structure where basically the oocytes will travel, and usually where fertilization will occur before it enters the uterus. And then right here is an ovary, and over here is an ovary. So obviously with the ovary is where a follicle will develop. We'll go through this all in a lot more depth as we go through, but a follicle will develop, it'll rupture, and it'll release the egg or the oocyte into that little fallopian tube. And usually that's where the sperm is going to meet it for fertilization to occur. And once that oocyte and sperm complex has developed into an embryo, it'll enter into the uterine horn. And then these little black things that you see right here, these are caruncles, so those are normal, but especially in our black face breeds, they tend to be black. But so this is where the uterus is going to implant and form something, we call it a placentome. So those are the sites where the uterus is attached between the baby and the mom, are at these sites here. Over here, this is just from a sheep that I think we were also doing embryo transfer on. I can't remember, it's from a while ago, but so this structure right here is a follicle, but it's a little bit larger of a follicle than we would expect. Over here on this side, this is more the size of a normal follicle that would contain an oocyte. So this one is what we would consider cystic. Unusual to see it in a sheep. Most of the time we would see it in goats. But unusual to see it, but not too surprising, because she had been super ovulated, so sometimes those drugs will induce them to form a cyst. And then over here is that fallopian tube, or that uterine tube right here where it's going down into the body. So just a couple of pictures. These are from a really nice website. It used to be called the Drost Project, out of University of Florida. Dr. Drost kind of created it, and he has since become humble and took his name off of it. So everybody is always going to call it the Drost Project. And now it's called VISGAR, the Visual Guide of Animal Reproduction. It has a lot of nice images for a few different species. So it had some nice dissected goat reproductive tracts. So this right here is the bladder. This is where the outside of the animal would be. And again, this is where the cervix is, going into this uterine body, bifurcating into these little horns right here. And you can't really see, I don't think there's an ovary right there. So this would be the uterine tube. It's just all stretched out. And this would be the ovary over here. And so this question came up last week. So I did find a couple of images here to show what the cervix looks like between a goat and a sheep. So we talked about how it's possible to do transcervical AI in the goat with frozen semen, but with the sheep, it doesn't work very well because of the anatomy of the cervix. So right here, we can see this is coming from the outside. So here's where the vagina would be. This is what we would call, and obviously this is dissected so we can see on the inside. This is what we call the external cervical os. And then coming in, we can see there's a cervical ring here, cervical ring here. So that's where you would put your AI rod in, and you kind of manipulate it so you get through this other cervical ring, this other cervical ring. And usually they've got about 3 to 4. This one's 1, 2, let's see, 1, 2, 3. I think this one's got 3 cervical rings. So you manipulate your pipette through there, and you can usually get it intrauterine to do your insemination. And so in comparison, this is what everything would look like in the sheep. And I liked this. This was a nice comparison. Everything externally looks pretty similar to what the goat is. Again, with this uterine body going into these uterine horns, ovaries, and fallopian tube, and the cervix. But when you open up the cervix, what you should notice is that there are a lot more cervical rings, and that the annular fold, what we call the annular folds that are around these cervical rings, are a lot more pronounced or kind of droopy looking. So we've got, here's kind of this, what we call the external cervical os. Again, this is where you would be coming in with your AI gun, and you can already see that this little annular fold here coming into the external os is really pronounced. And so just even getting in that first cervical ring, you could usually see it. So you can kind of aim towards where you would get in there. But then once you get in, you continuously get stuck in each of these folds for these really pronounced rings. And there's more of them. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. There's at least 5 here. I know some of them can have 6 to 8. So that's why it becomes so difficult with sheep, because you're coming from the outside. And then the question was asked last time about cows, and cows, the cervix is a little bit closer to what the goat is, where it's got those 3 to 4 rings, but we can also do transrectal palpation and manipulate that cervix around the AI gun, whereas obviously with sheep and goats, we can't really do that due to their size restrictions. And then this is just if you're interested in what it would look like on ultrasonography. So this is how I do ultrasonography of the reproductive tract. If I'm looking, especially if I'm looking for issues with infertility, is I do transrectal. I just put it on a little rectal introducer. So basically we're going in the rectum, and then you are sitting right on, it's nice because you're sitting on right on top of the uterus. So it's like when we're doing the cow, how we palpate them, except we're just doing it with an ultrasound. And this is what those images would look like. So right up here is on this little gray thing here is all uterus. Over here is an ovary, and this little black structure is a follicle. So this was actually part of a research project we were doing where they were all synchronized, and we were inducing synchronization, looking at the time to ovulation. So this is a pre-ovulatory follicle. So she was in estrus and getting ready to ovulate. Down here, this big thing is just bladder. So that's usually the structure I use to make sure I'm in the right spot when I go in, because again, this is kind of a blind going in with my ultrasound probe. So I see the bladder and I know I'm in the right spot, and I can start scanning around looking for this uterus. And then over here, so usually what happens is you just end up scanning side to side to try to find another ovary. So this is another ovary over here. And she had a couple of different follicles. So that's what these little black things are. So the black means that it's full of fluid. So same as the bladder here. And you can see here, I'm a little bit deeper in beyond that bladder, and I'm a little bit more off to the side, which is why it doesn't look quite as big. And then this is just another picture from doing flushes, what the uterus looks like once we have it outside the body. So just kind of a introduction to how understanding that anatomy, how we can use that when we're doing any kind of evaluation of them. Okay, so kind of moving into a little bit of the physiology. So I wanted to start with puberty, because obviously that's when they're starting to cycle. So our influencing factors for this, so their age, obviously, you got to reach a certain age for all of the maturation of the structures in the brain that are responsible for the gonads to be able to respond to the hormones being produced. Nutritional status, and this is, again, no different from humans, where if they're severely malnourished and have a low body condition, it's going to take them longer to achieve puberty, specifically because they're shuttling all their energy towards their vital organs. So reproduction tends to come in last when it comes to that ranking. And then season, specifically the season in which they were born, can have an effect. And that's because we briefly talked last time about how seasonality plays a role. These are seasonal species. So if they're born in the spring, they tend to come into season come into puberty a little bit earlier than if they're fall born, because if they're fall born, they'll be outside of season when they start to hit. I've got a few of the different time frames here, but you can see on average, it tends to be about 6 months that they come into puberty. The males will start a little bit earlier, and different breeds like your pygmy goats will start a little bit earlier, but most of your girls will be 6 to 8 months. So if 6 to 8 months is in the middle of spring when they're out of season, they're probably not going to come into heat, because they're not going to get in or come into puberty because they're not getting the stimulus for it. Whereas if they were born in the spring and hitting this 6 to 8 months, then they will be able to undergo puberty. And then breed will have an effect on this too. And that kind of goes along the same lines of there's certain breeds that do better with out of season, coming into season, or coming into puberty out of season and breeding out of season. So those types of breeds, which I do have a slide that lists a few of those that have more of the extended breeding season, then they'll have a better time hitting puberty earlier, especially if it's in the out of season time. And then we'll talk about this a lot more with the management talk that I'm giving, but exposure to a male, what we call the ram or buck effect. can influence it too. So if you've got some females that are considered to be peripubertal, so they haven't quite hit puberty, but they're starting to come into season, you could probably trigger them to start cycling a little bit sooner by exposing to a new male. And like I said, we'll talk about that a lot more later. And even with the timing to puberty, you do want to make sure that they're at least 2/3 of their adult body weight. So just because they're coming into heat at 3 months of age doesn't mean that you should necessarily breed them. So most of the time we will breed them in that first that 6 to 8 month period, but you do want to make sure that they've been growing appropriately and that they are reaching about 2/3 of their body weights when they're bred, that so that they're getting close to that body weight by the time that they give birth. Okay, so just going a little bit more in depth into the estrous cycle. So I think I had this slide last time. So it's the estrous cycle itself is a predictable reproductive event, and it begins with estrus, which is that period that we can see where they're in heat, and it ends with the subsequent estrus. So that's what we say when we're talking about the estrus cycle. And then everything that's contained in that we'll go through a lot more in depth here in the next few slides. So the sheep, this takes about 17 days. Goats take about 21 days. And this will continue throughout the female's life and gets interrupted by certain things like pregnancy, if they're nursing, season, again, our small ruminants. And the whole purpose of the estrous cycle is to provide continuous opportunities for breeding to occur. So the estrous cycle it's divided into 2 phases, and then within the phases there are stages. So we're going to start with just the phases itself. So the phases are named after the dominant structure that's present on the ovary during each of the phase. So the follicular phase is the phase during which that they have a follicle. So again, I showed you on the ultrasound and some of those images. This is what a fluid-filled follicle looks like, and that's what's producing estrogen. So the primary hormone is estradiol or estrogen. We use those terms interchangeably. And it's a growing dominant follicle that's getting ready to ovulate. So this is what has the egg in it. Obviously they'll have multiple follicles because each follicle will have 1 egg in it. So if they're going to ovulate 2 eggs or 3 eggs, that's going to determine how many babies that they end up getting. And the whole point, the whole thing that happens during that phase is basically to prepare the uterus for sperm transport and for fertilization to occur. The uterus becomes quite toned, and that allows for that sperm to traverse pretty quickly through the uterus to get up to that uterine tube where it's going to meet the egg and promote ovulation. So that's the whole point of what this estradiol is doing.
Dr. Stewart, just you tell me when the first question will be.
Oh, yes. Sorry. So you can go ahead and do the first question. I already forgot about it. So you can go ahead and do the first question now.
Okay. Yeah.
I meant to do it after we talked about the anatomy.
Okay. So are you seeing the question?
Yes. So there should be a question for everyone. So this is based on the talk that we had about anatomy. Just to make sure that everybody is paying attention.
Yeah, they are answering very fast. So that means that they are taking attention. 50% already, more than 50%. Okay, very soon I will share the results. I think when I get 80% of the people answering, I will be, yeah, okay. Yeah, some people are very analytical, so they want to read twice the answers to select one. So I am one of those, yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay, over there the results.
Oh, 90%. That's pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. So the answer is the B. So What is the right answer? Is B?
Yes, the right answer is B. So sheep frequently have a greater number of cervical rings and more pronounced annular folds compared with goats. So that's why it's more difficult, because we can't manipulate the artificial insemination rod through that tortuous cervix.
Okay. Okay, I will stop sharing and you can continue with your presentation.
Okay.
And you allowed me to know when is the next question.
Yes, I will. I'll hopefully try to remember.
You know, I tell you, yeah.
Thank you. Okay. All right, so moving on to the second estrous cycle phase. So this one, and again, these phases are named after the dominant structure. So this is what we call the luteal phase, because the primary ovarian structure is the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum actually stands for yellow body. So you'll notice over here, and this is a cow ovary, but you'll notice this corpus luteum structure is yellow. And that's, this is a real cow ovary. So this is really how they look. So that's where the name came from, is yellow body. And so this is basically what forms after that follicle ovulates and ruptures. All of the cells that are within where that follicle ovulated remodel, and they basically build this structure after so many days, and it produces progesterone. So the entire purpose of this CL forming is to start preparing that uterus for pregnancy. So we've had fertilization occurs, and then, in a few days, about 6 or 7 days, that fertilized conceptus is going to enter the uterus, and it's going to need to find a place to implant itself within that uterus. And so the progesterone is basically making the lining nice and thick so that the conceptus can have a place to implant and start signaling to the body that pregnancy needs to be maintained. Okay, and so this is just a brief overview of those two phases that I went through. So, and I talked about these a little bit last time. So in this follicular phase, so this is where that estrous period that we talked about is. So day 0 being estrus. So, and it's going to be a little bit leading up to that. So we've got this period where that corpus luteum goes away, and we start to get that dominant follicle or follicles being developed, and those are going to produce estrogen. I'll talk a lot more about that in just a couple slides here. We reach the peak estrogen, and that's going to trigger that estrous behavior. And so, which is going to then trigger our LH surge, which promotes ovulation. So then after ovulation, that follicle goes away, so all the progesterone starts going down, and that's where that corpus luteum is going to start developing. And you'll notice that it takes several days for that corpus luteum to become fully functional. And then during this time, this is just giving that we've got this high progesterone, it's giving time for that embryo to start signaling the factor that it needs to maintain pregnancy, so that then this progesterone will just continue to stay high for pregnancy. If it doesn't, then it goes away and everything starts over. All right, so those are the two phases. And then I think this is probably the parts that I briefly talked about last time, were the stages that are within there. So within that follicular phase, we've got two different stages, which are proestrus and estrus. So estrus, I already talked about, being the time that they're actually showing behavior, and they're able to be receptive and have peak estradiol secretion. Proestrus is the period before that, where that ovulatory follicle is forming and estradiol is starting to rise. So this is what we consider a transitional period, because it's after the corpus luteum has lysed and has started going away. And so the progesterone's going down and this estrogen's going up. And so after estrus occurs, so again, we hit that peak estrogen secretion. So then the animal will ovulate that follicle, and that estrogen will start to go down because the follicle is no longer there. And then that CL is going to start forming, but it's not quite functional yet. Instead, it forms what we call corpus hemorrhagicum, which is just, again, named after kind of what it looks like. So it's a little bloody body. So it looks like a little blood blister on there. And it's basically going to look like that as the cells start to remodel and produce progesterone before it becomes a fully functional CL. So it's just again, another transitional time right here where estrogen's going down and progesterone's going up. And then it's not really well described in most species. I would say ruminants, we have a little bit better grasp on it than other species. So we do talk a lot more in ruminants than we do in things like horses, if anybody here has horses that they breed. So then the diestrus is when that CL is fully functional and we're getting that sustained secretion of progesterone. So again, this is just the same chart except broken down into those stages where we've got that pro-estrus, again, pro meaning before, so everything leading up to estrus. So you see this transitional period where progesterone's going down and estrogen's going up. And then we've got estrus occurring, ovulation, and then again, we've got our second transitional period where estrogen's going down and progesterone's going up, leading us into our diestrus period where we've got that sustained release of progesterone preparing for pregnancy. So what governs all that? So, and again, I talked about this very superficially last time, so I'm going to try to cover it a little bit more in depth this time. So, and I talked about the hypothalamus, which is in the brain, producing that gonadotropin releasing hormone. So this is our master regulator of reproduction. So it kind of governs everything that happens. So the GnRH is going to, the GnRH being released from the hypothalamus is going to get secreted to the pituitary. So this is kind of near like the brainstem area. So this GnRH goes through the bloodstream, comes down here to the pituitary. So the pituitary secretes a lot of things. So this is where AL means anterior lobe. So it's the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So it secretes a lot of things, but for the purposes of this, what we care about is that it secretes that luteinizing hormone and that follicle stimulating hormone. And so initially in that pro-estrus phase, there's going to be a growing follicle that's going to secrete increasing amounts of estrogen. So the bigger the follicle, the more estrogen that it releases. So when there's small amounts of estrogen that are being produced, the GnRH will preferentially select FSH to be secreted so that it can continue to trigger that follicle to grow. So this is follicle stimulating hormone. So it means that it's stimulating that follicle to grow. Once that follicle starts approaching its dominant size and doesn't need to grow anymore, it's gonna have a lot of estrogen that's secreting. And so that high amount of estrogen actually will trigger what we call the surge center here. And it's going to trigger a different pattern of GnRH secretion that is then going to preferentially choose for LH to get secreted. And that's where I talked about last time, and I alluded to it before, is luteinizing hormone. The surge of it that we get is what promotes that follicle to ovulate. And it's all governed by the amount of estrogen that's being produced. And this is so these pictures are all from the Pathways to Pregnancy and Parturition book by Dr. Sanger. So anybody that's ever taken a reproduction class in undergraduate or anywhere, this is kind of the major book that everybody uses. So, and this is everything that I just said, but there's some nice figure here that shows what I'm talking about. So we've got kind of these smaller follicles here that are developing on the ovary. It's secreting estrogen. And again, that's triggering a preferential release of FSH because that's triggering these follicles to keep growing. So then as the follicles start growing more, they're going to produce more estrogen. And so we are already starting to see that shift. So you see the different sizes of these arrows is kind of different concentrations. So now we're starting to decrease our FSH a little bit and we're getting a little bit more LH. And then here you can see we've got a lot more estrogen. That FSH, we don't really need to stimulate any more growth, but we need to get it to ovulate. So that's where it's kind of dumping that LH, or that's what we call the LH surge. That's going to trigger ovulation of that dominant follicle. And then you might notice over here, there's a little eye here. So these follicles, as they start growing, they start to produce another hormone called inhibin. And that acts directly on the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And that also helps to decrease that FSH production. So it's kind of a negative feedback mechanism right there. And then you get ovulation from this site on the ovary. And that site of ovulation, like I said, is going to remodel. It's going to become the corpus hemorrhagicum first. And that eventually will remodel and luteinize to produce the corpus luteum. So we're in the luteal phase. So all those names kind of go together. So just talking a little bit more about estrus itself. So we typically will see estrus. You don't see that actual behavioral estrus unless that plasma progesterone is low. So usually less than 1 nanogram per mil is the concentration. We're not usually measuring this in goats. I've done it occasionally if we're looking for some diagnostics for different pathologies. But what you see, there's two different parts of that estrus is kind of early in that estrus. They might be proceptive, where they're seeking out and trying to stimulate a male. So that's where the goats are flagging their tails, and they're kind of starting to increase their activity. So if you're putting pedometers on them, things like that, you'll see their activity start to increase. And then once they get into like where they're closer to that time of ovulation, that's where they become receptive, where they start to express their immobilization reflex. So if you got a marker on your male, that's when he's going to start testing them and seeing if it's safe for him to mount them and breed them. So, or if you've got a teaser, same thing. Other things that you might see is swollen vulva, and then a lot of times we'll see that mucoid discharge. And especially in goats, you start to see that as they get close, it starts off kind of clear, and then as they get closer to ovulation, it'll tend to turn cloudy. And this is just a nice little chart that's showing kind of this like proceptive, receptive behavior. And here's where that LH surge is occurring. So that's going to promote ovulation probably over in this area here. So, so when we're trying to show or figure out if females are in heat, so we were doing some AI on these girls, so they were synchronized, but you can bring a male by, and you see her tail is up. They're kind of showing interest. If you go in and press on their back, you can start trying to look for that immobilization reflex. But so we were just walking him by so that we could see, just check to see if they were looking like they were in heat. And then again, with sheep, they tend to be a little bit more stoic and not show as much. So just sticking a marker on them usually is sufficient. You can see back here, they've got little marks on their butt back here from where he was mounting them by having a chest marker on. And the duration of that estrus period for sheep is going to be about 30 to 36 hours. Goats, it's more variable and again can vary by breed. So about 24 to 48 hours. And then here's another video. These were the ones I told you, the project that I did where we were actually synchronizing them. So these girls were all in heat together, and you can see she's nosing around, really flagging her tail. So all of these girls, if you've got them in heat together, that always helps because they tend to like help each other show the signs if you don't have a teaser male. So if you've got a group that you're syncing, you can see she's being a little obnoxious, and that's just normal. And then again, you see we've got the proceptive, which is when they'll usually start to mount, and then they're receptive when they start to stand. So again, if you've got a couple, these are all females. So if you've got several females, you can synchronize together. It really helps to be able to see those signs. And then another interesting part is their follicular waves. And so this is why we can synchronize and short cycle and do all this stuff, is because even when they're in that luteal phase, they'll continuously have these follicular waves where you get a wave of follicles from that ovary that are going to grow and then regress and grow and regress. And they can only grow to ovulation if the progesterone goes away. So within an estrus cycle, so these are used over here. So you've got like a 17-day period. Within that 17-day period, you'll notice like they'll have one wave of follicles and then it goes away because the progesterone's high and they're not ready to ovulate. Then you get another cohort of follicles that grow and then goes away. And then you've got a third one that grows. And right here is where that corpus luteum is going away. So that's the cohort of follicles that are going to be selected to go on and ovulate. And so when we think about short cycling, which again, we'll talk more about when we do management, is that we're basically going to give them something like Lutalice to make the corpus luteum go away earlier so that we can have them breed off of one of these other follicular waves. And they'll continuously have these follicular waves even when they're pregnant, even when they're out of season, they'll have a lot of these follicular waves. They just kind of keep going, but they don't really do anything unless the hypothalamus is primed to receive the estrogen that they're producing and that there's no progesterone, or the estrogen they're producing and there's no progesterone around. So those are two things that'll have to happen. And then when you get and the reason why these are important is we'll have anywhere between 3 and 4 follicular waves within that period. But sometimes you'll get double ovulations that most of the time are going to be from each of these waves. But sometimes we'll get 2 consecutive waves that she can ovulate from. So she'll ovulate from here and then produce another wave. And then in a few days, she'll ovulate again. And if there's still sperm in the reproductive tract, she can actually breed off of that. So if you've ever had 2 lambs or 2 kids that were born several days apart, but everybody was alive miraculously. I've seen this a few times, especially with our VT sheep barn. We've seen it a few times. That can happen, and it's usually because of that, because it's coming from 2 consecutive waves. Or if you have one that just looks smaller and premature and you're like, I don't know why this one's so much smaller than the other one, that can be why too. So they can be born at the same time and look vastly different. And it can be because of when fertilization occurred. And so the ovulation number is going to vary also by breed, season, and nutrition. So a lot of the same things that affected puberty that I talked about earlier. And again, when we talk about management, I'm going to talk about nutritional flushing that we do and how we can do that to promote higher ovulation numbers to try to get more twins being born. And then we have anestrus. So this is just, again, an being without estrus. And that's a condition where the female does not have any regular estrous cycles. The ovaries are inactive, so there's no ovulation, there's no development of major structures. So this corpus luteum is not developing. Again, you might have some really small follicles because they'll still have some follicular waves, but they're not going to grow and become dominant follicles. And I briefly touched on this, but we've got pregnancy because of the progesterone influence, lactation. A lot of times this has to do with how often they're suckling, season. So I'm going to talk about that in a lot more detail on the next couple slides. Nutrition, again, they've got to be in a good energy balance to cycle. Stress, things like stress can alter their ability to cycle. And then any types of pathology can definitely affect their ability to cycle. So just kind of talking about the seasonal stuff is that they're seasonally polyestrous. So when we think about like our cow, for example, they'll continuously cycle no matter what all throughout their whole life unless they become pregnant and are nursing. So those are things that'll stop it. Whereas our small ruminants will not cycle when they're out of season and then cycle when they're in season and then go out of season again. So that's where they're seasonally polyestrous. So they have multiple estrus periods, but it's all within a season. And so again, same thing that I kind of talked about. One is photoperiod, which I'll talk about the influence of melatonin on the next few slides. Latitude and climate. So the closer you are to the equator, the longer the days are. And the more likely that the females are kind of adjusted to those longer days, especially if it's the tropical type breeds. So they tend to adjust to that and be able to breed longer. Food availability, the presence of a male breeding system, physiological stage. This is all stuff we're going to talk about when we talk about manipulating it for the reproduction and management.
Do you want the second question?
Not yet.
Okay.
I know we're close, but I'm gonna
Okay.
talk about
Okay.
next
Yeah.
few slides.
Okay.
Okay, so just taking you through, I talked about this briefly last time, so this hopefully is a review for everybody that's watched the first one. So when we have that decrease in day length, it's going to decrease the firing of retinal nerves that are detected from the eye. So here we have a lot of dark coming in. And it's going to decrease excitation from the superior cervical ganglion. So that's your SCG over here. And then that's going to decrease inhibition of that pineal gland. And decreasing the inhibition of it means that we're going to increase melatonin. So all of that to say is when you have decreased day length, you have increased melatonin. That should not surprise anyone because we take melatonin to help us sleep at night. So, you know, the more night there is, the more melatonin is being produced. And then in small ruminants, that increase in melatonin directly will stimulate GnRH production from the hypothalamus. And that's how this is all regulated, because having increased GnRH production, GnRH is that master regulator. So that's where we're going to have increased melatonin production to trigger our seasonality. And then, so this is just that one that I just showed. So this is the opposite, where it's the long days. We've got more light and less dark, and then it's going to trigger low melatonin release. So then it's going to basically shut down this hypothalamus so that GnRH isn't being produced. And so when we go through the management and talking about breeding out of season, you definitely want to make sure that you're selecting breeds that have an extended reproductive season. So, so these are just kind of a list, and I'll go ahead and just leave this up here for you guys to look at, and we can go ahead and put up the next question before I forget again and go any farther.
Okay. Okay. There you go.
If anybody wanted to write any of these names down, then I'll leave this slide up here while you guys are doing the questions.
Okay, the people start answering.
And I thought this one might throw some people off. So very few people look like maybe they're getting thrown off just based on what I was talking about, but we'll kind of see where the numbers end up.
Yeah, there is interesting question there. The last chat, having light in the barn, if that will be making any interference.
It has to be, so will leaving a light on in the barn overnight create seasonality issues with goats might come into heat middle to late November? It could. It depends on the intensity of the lights and how long you're actually keeping them on, and if you're continuously doing it. So I know in my management talk that I do cover like kind of how you like how much you have to keep the lights on to be able to start affecting it. So but it could, if it's a bright enough light and you're leaving it on continuously overnight, is the short answer.
Okay, I will be ending the poll.
Okay.
Sharing results.
So I thought this might confuse people because I talk about the master regulator being GnRH, but the primary parts of this is it's the primary regulator of seasonality, and it's produced by the pineal gland. So that's where the answer should be melatonin, because the melatonin is actually controlling the GnRH at this time.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. All right. So in these last few minutes that we have, I wanted to, because I will be talking a little bit about males and stuff as we go through here. So I wanted to cover a little bit of male anatomy, kind of just for completeness. So here's our male over here. And these are kind of a little bit reversed from each other. So, so they've got the bladder, and then they have these accessory sex glands up here that help to produce all the seminal plasma that contributes to kind of that fluid part of the ejaculate. And basically your testes are down here. So this is what their vas deferens or ductus deferens, you'll see different terminologies for that. So this is basically the sperm are produced here. It comes up through your vas deferens, and it's going to join with the fluids being produced by your accessory sex glands. And then all of this is going to come through your urethra, which obviously they would urinate out of when they're urinating, but now it's just being used to shuttle semen when they're ejaculating. It goes through this little sigmoid flexure here, which you can see the picture of right over here. So basically there's a muscle right here that's continuously contracted. It's called the retractor penis muscle. And when it relaxes, it basically stretches, or this whole thing becomes straight instead of an S shape. the sigmoid flexure, and that's what allows that penis to exteriorize, and so that he can mount and enter the female and ejaculate. And then the other thing that most of you owning sheep and goats probably know is that they've got this little process on the penis that looks like a little worm, called the urethral process. It's just an extension of their urethra. It's thought to kind of help distribute the semen around in the female reproductive tract a little bit more. But it's also the first thing we tend to excise when they have a urethral blockage, and they can breed without it. So it's not anything that's necessary, but it's thought to kind of help with some of that breeding process. Nobody really knows why. And so over here, kind of on this dissected track, the vesicular gland over here, we've got ampulla, and then the prostate. These are all the primary parts of the accessory sex glands that I talked about that contribute to that fluid, and then the bulbourethral glands in here. But then the rest of this should be all the same. So here's your bladder. This is your ductus deferens that's coming from that testicles that I pointed out over here. And then all the semen's going to be coming out here. I've got some more pictures of the testicles as we go through. This is just kind of another image of it. So you can see, again, he's got this little urethral process on here that's normal. So we just had him up. We were looking at his, I don't remember why we were looking at his penis, but we were for some reason, and trimming his feet. But again, just kind of showing this little picture here. So the sigmoid flexure, usually you can palpate it behind their scrotum. Because when we flip them on their butts, you can actually push on it to get that penis to come out if you ever needed to look at it for some reason. So males are also affected by seasonality. So unlike females, they don't have cycles, but instead that GnRH and LH is continuously being produced. So just like females, when there's decreased melatonin, there's going to be decreased GnRH production, which is going to decrease. So again, they still have LH coming from that pituitary gland. So they have decreased LH, and LH actually acts on Leydig cells of the testicles, and it promotes testosterone production. So when there's, so when you have more melatonin in season, you're going to have more GnRH, you're going to have more LH, and your testosterone is going to be higher. So when they're out of season and all of this is decreased, it's going to decrease their sperm quality and their output. And this makes sense when we look at, if you've ever looked at your males out of season, so their scrotal circumference can drop by up to 30% outside of the breeding season. And again, this is breed specific. We've got breeds that are very not affected by season. Again, our tropical breeds, our hair breeds, our haired sheep breeds, things like that, they don't tend to be quite as affected as some of our like temperate wool breeds. And they can usually still breed females, just not quite as many. And I'll talk about in the management section again how we usually want to alter, our male to female ratio selection when we're figuring out males outside of the breeding season. And so this is just another nice little diagram that's showing, again, this LH is basically helping to stimulate production of testosterone, which is needed to produce sperm. So when everything's decreased, then the semen quality is going to be affected. And we typically will evaluate the testes. This is always a good thing for you guys to kind of keep an eye on too, especially if you're wanting to breed, because this is what we would call cryptorchidism, where they only have one testicle descended. If they're not descended at birth, it's very unlikely they're going to descend later on. So it's always good to make sure that there's two testes descended, because it is heritable. And when we're evaluating them, we're going to assess tone, we're assessing symmetry between the two, temperature. And we always want to make sure we're palpating the epididymis, which is here at the bottom. So this is like the bottommost portion of it, because this is where a lot of, especially sheep, but I've seen it quite a few times in goats, will get disease down here in the tail of the epididymis. And then we're going to measure their scrotal circumference as part of our routine exams. And the reason why we do this is because it correlates with their sperm quality and their sperm output. We want to make sure that we kind of pull the testes down so they're all the way in the scrotum, and we usually measure it around the widest portion of the scrotum just using a scrotal circumference tape. And it's very species and breed specific. So when we're looking at measurements, I try to find, if I can, a species or breed specific type measurements, but I've also found that there's quite a few individual animal measurements and trends. So I usually just measure it for the purposes of that animal and looking from season to season if things change. And you'll notice again, as they go out of season, that it's going to fluctuate. So, don't be surprised if you measure out of season if it drops quite a bit. But like I said, I tend to focus more on how the testicles palpate, making sure they've got enough tone, and that they're symmetrical and not too soft or not too firm. Okay, let's see. And then, I've got a whole talk on this, but this is just kind of like a preview of you can actually measure testicular volume. You can look at their shape. And I'll talk about some of the things that we're using with looking at the echogenicity of our testicles. But just showing that there's a lot of other things that we can do to look at them besides just measuring them specifically. And where this becomes important is, especially with the shape, is that bulls that have longer shaped testes produce more sperm per day than those that had more spherical shaped testes, even if their scrotal circumference was larger or equal. So just showing how sometimes looking at shape can matter too, rather than just the scrotal circumference. And this is just showing that's why we look at the size, especially scrotal circumference. It's because each testicle has these little seminiferous tubules in here, and this is what we're looking at in these histology pictures. And the more seminiferous tubules that you have, so these are sperm being produced in the middle of these and being secreted, and then they're going to go out. So they're basically being produced. They're going to get secreted. They're going to go into this epididymis down, and they're pretty much stored here in this tail until ejaculation. And then that's where they go to the rest of the reproductive tract. So if we have more testicular volume, our scrotal circumference is usually bigger, and that just means we have more of those little sperm making areas. And we also have more Leydig cells, which means we have more testosterone production. And like I said, as far as like the scrotal circumference goes, we've got a pretty good grasp on some of our rams. Again, these are more for our temperate breeds. I found that things like our haired breeds are going to vary a little bit more. So if you've got different groups, you can kind of look at your trends, but kind of around 30 to 33 for our younger ones, and then greater than 36 centimeters for our large adult rams that are bigger in size. Bucks, we have even less, we have even less standards. So I tend to go like 25 centimeters is kind of like my minimum cutoff before I start to get worried. But again, I tend to focus more on how they're palpating and what the size is in that individual animal year to year. And this is just from a study that I'm working on getting published right now. Keeping in mind that when they're post-pubertal, up until they reach about a year and a half old, their scrotal circumference is actually still going to grow. So here, as they were getting into summer, their scrotal circumference actually was starting to increase rather than decreasing in the summer. So they were starting off at about 7 to 9.5 months old, and then here's right at the end of the summer. So this is August, right as everything was starting to change. So keeping in mind that when they're young, the trend that you might see in regards to size might differ also. And again, I'll talk more about this with the males, but since I mentioned it, here's one that had that epididymitis that I talked about. You can see how this side is kind of red down here and enlarged. But you really have to palpate it to appreciate that it's the epididymis, not the testicle. Whereas over here, this was a large testicle over here that we had found on examination. Okay, so we've got, I think, we probably got the last question.
The last question, okay. The people is very smart.
Yeah, everybody,
Yeah.
we've got a good grasp on this one.
Yeah, Yeah, only because we are a lot of people, will be very awesome to have like a panel discussion with everybody, with all the experience that the people have, all the attendees, all the farmers will be cool. Yeah, but probably we will need 2, 3 hours. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, but now, if any person has questions, there was a questions over there, people saying that what is the difference when you have a singles or doubles or triples in the milk production? So I found out in a research project with sheep that the ewes that were having like a doubles and triples were producing more milk with estrus crossbreeding with catadine. So we found that. So I don't know if you have any experience about that.
Let's see, the number of kids delivers at one time will impact milk production for that season. More kids equals more milk. Um, and I don't do a whole lot of dairy work. I feel like most of the breeds that I've worked with are beef breeds. So I've not experienced that or have dealt with that specifically. We've got a couple of people around here that kind of on a low scale do
Mhm.
milk goats.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
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 not enough numbers for me to have
yeah,
noticed it like
yeah.
that.
Yeah, generally with dairy is small ruminants, sheep and goats, that's happening. When you have animals that produce more milk, also is naturally they produce more kids or more lambs, and that is happening in general. So there is that trend. Yeah.
Do you notice that even if you pull babies off to supplement them, or do you think it's the stimulus from having
I
multiple babies?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I don't have enough evidence, but I think it's enough only because it's like the physiological information. So if any person have experience, they can share also in the chat about this question. Because I think it's interesting. In many places, the main business will be the milk production. So, but also will be very interesting about selection because what we know is that reproduction is not a threat to be like a selecting because the heritability is not very high in reproduction. But I think it's very interesting to be related with milk production because milk production has a high heritability, okay, as the weight of the meat in the like when the animals are like a mature age, probably 10, 11 months. That weight is high heritability also. I think we are going to have a very good information next week. Yeah. Okay, here is the answer. Do you want to
Yeah.
see? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think again, 90% of you got it. So the sperm quality and output will decline outside of the natural breeding season. So they're not completely infertile, but usually you're just limited as to how many females they can breed. And with that comes a corresponding decrease in scrotal circumference size. So not rather than an increase.
Okay. Jennifer, do you want to go through the questions, please?
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
Thank you.
So you caught on a couple of them. So what about with supplementing rams with melatonin, would that increase their breeding or sperm quality?
Yes. And I talked about this a little bit in the first session. So there's no approved source of melatonin, but there is I know at least one company that does sell melatonin implants. The kind of it's not labeled or anything, but it's one of those kind of gray areas of giving it. So you won't find a vet to prescribe it, but it doesn't seem like you need a vet to obtain it. But it does hypothetically help to increase sperm quality. And I believe there are studies out there that have shown that.
And do we have to worry about any withdrawal periods or anything if we send that animal to slaughter?
Nobody's going to be testing for it, so is the short answer. And it's melatonin's a naturally occurring compound in the body. I believe like the source that they use is this, it's probably some kind of purified substance of it. So you probably don't have to worry about any kind of withdrawal period on it because of that.
And then we've got two questions about testicles. So are split scrotums considered a demerit? And does the distance between the testicles and the body make a difference on sperm counts?
So I've seen split scrotums and their sperm quality have just been fine. So unless it's just something you don't want to select for in your herd, out of the risk of it developing into something else, I have not seen any issues with their sperm quality on the few that I've seen. They're not very common. And then the other one, the distance from the body, yes, absolutely. So the sperm thermoregulate themselves. So when it's cold out, they pull the testes closer to the body, and when it's hot out, they kind of let them a little bit loose. So you might see some variation just because of that weather. But if they are kind of loosey-goosey and can't retract up close to the body, they're going to be more prone for things like if you're in an area where there's a lot of snow, they'll be more prone to frostbite, and they just can't really thermoregulate quite as well. So the ones that are a little bit looser and can't kind of like go up and down on their own.
Gotcha. And then what about you showing no interest? If she's showing no interest, does that mean she's not in heat? And do they only cycle at the same time each year? I guess is part of that question.
So if the U is showing no interest and with a male present, so I would just say like if you're just kind of like going out and checking them yourselves, U's tend to not show a whole lot of outward signs. But if you've got a teaser or a ram in there and she's showing no interest, usually that does mean that she's not in heat. And then do they only cycle the same each year? I guess I don't understand completely what that question means.
So Nicole, if you can update that, we'll try to come back to that if we have time. So what about supplementing with vitamin E or selenium? Does that do anything to sperm?
Probably not in the short term. If you're in a very selenium deficient area, then it could help if they are deficient in it. But but just, going to an animal that has no problems and giving it to him, or an animal that does have problems giving it to him, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to help improve swimming, if they're not deficient in it to begin with.
Gotcha. And then we've got a few questions here about you've intrigued them with the female goat storing viable sperm. So there's been some questions about how long, if it's possible to have two different sires with two different kids or offspring. You've intrigued them here.
Yeah, you can, if you've got a couple sires out there, it's definitely possible, especially if they're if they've got access to breeding her within a few hours of each other. And the sperm, I don't like, so this is more going to be a fresh sperm thing. So if you're doing AI with them, the frozen thawed sperm's probably not going to last that long. But if they're getting, ram bred, that sperm can live in there for several days.
Gotcha. And then Nicole did clarify her question. She was talking about when they have lambs, is there a pattern each year when they cycle?
Let's see, when they have lambs, is there a pattern each year when they cycle? I like within an individual animal basis, I'm not sure. But kind of like as a herd, yes, because as a herd, they're all going to be kind of the same breed. You have a lot of similar genetics in there. So kind of as a group, they can kind of trigger each other to start cycling too. So I would imagine there's probably some individual animal component to that also.
Gotcha. And I think the last question that I see here is about an intersex goat. Is it possible for them to get pregnant?
Unlikely. It depends on what their degree of intersex is. So most of the ones that I've seen there's really no chance.
Gotcha.
So I would say the majority, no.
And then I don't want to put you on the spot, but there is some questions about a dosing of melatonin per 100
I
pounds.
can't say that I know the dose off the top of my head. There's usually just like the implants you can buy, and it's like one implant that you give. So, but I don't know what the dose is off the top of my head.
Kind of a slow release type thing.
Yes.
Yep. So I don't see any other
oral.
questions here.
One of the things that some researchers in France, in Mexico, working with goats, they have been found is you know the longest day. What is when we have more day hours is like June 24, 25, something like that.
21.
21. Okay, thank you. So they found that in the natural herds over there, when it's like the days are getting longer. So when the days are getting longer, is the males, the bucks are getting all this information. So when the day in the 21st is the longest, in the 22nd start getting like a shorter. In that moment, just trigger the animals and start like a very high libido. Okay, so it's very sensitive to the change of the to get longer and shorter. So it's what they do with the light. So they have like a long during the winter. They have long days, like a long days with light. So they shorter the night, like instead of getting dark 6 o'clock, start dark like 8 o'clock, and then get like earlier, like instead of getting the light at 7 o'clock in the morning, getting the light 5 o'clock in the morning. So they have short nights. So they keep that during the winter, and then start just getting like a like a longer night. So the animals just start getting like the libido in the spring. Okay, just simulating that is like the summer. So, and it's good research, and probably people have experience on that, and that is for off-season animals. So probably we can be talking about the different alternatives, like a male effect when you have an animal that is already a libido and just bringing to the females, or as you say, when the females are active, so they may be just inviting the males to get in the libido. All that things I think are very interesting. Yeah. So is there any other question? We are out of time, I think 11 minutes, but it's very interesting. I mean, it's not my area, but I have been just listening reproduction people for years, and it's so interesting. And it's very related to everything. I mean, with the light, with the physiology of the animal after breeding, because you have sometimes an estrus that is post-kidding, because lactation, because nutrition, because many things. So reproduction is the key, as you were saying, okay? And but you have to manage. Okay, for example, in Mexico, we had a problem of fertility, but because they have one buck for 75 females. So the buck couldn't be working with 75 females during the season that they were open. Okay, that will be like 2-3 months. So you need more males. Okay, so many practical things sometimes happening with some farmers. Okay, so well, thank you so much for all the people here. And just remember that we are going to send Dr. Stewart presentation, a PDF, for those ones that came here. And also we are going to make a referral of 5 books, so another 5 books for the people that send their name. And next, I will be sharing. Let me see if I can share. Do you see now this?
Yes.
Okay, so December 1st, we'll be selecting for reproduction. I think will be in a small ruminant from Dr. Philip Sponen. I'm sorry, Sponenberg. He's very good. And then December 8th, again, Dr. Jim Stewart, and December 15th. So I will be sending this information. And And later on, we have like a break for winter, December 22nd, 29th, and January 5th. And we have resume after that. So just remember to be watching. If you don't receive an email, go to your folder, the junk folder, just to see you receive over there, because probably some people have received emails over there and are in the junk folder. So thank you so much, Dr. Stewart, Jennifer Lutz, and we see you next Monday.
Thank you.